Have you figured out your niche? Are you helping adding value to other people's lives? Then you're in the right place. Welcome to Munira's Musings with your host, co-author of Conversations with Top Real Estate Investors Volume 3, Munira Zahabi.
Greetings from Chicagoland. This is Munira, the CEO and founder of Kismet Ventures. I am the niche navigator where I help people find their niche and market to it. I am also the master interviewer where I have a show called Munira's Musings. And my guest today is Nathan. Hi, Nathan.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. And Nathan is calling us from where?
I'm in the small town of Bucerias in the state of Nayarit in Mexico.
Nice.
So if you don't know where that is, it's about 30 minutes north of the coastal town of Puerto Vallarta. It's a popular tourist destination down here.
Nice. So you have, your life is made because you're in the best climate and you don't have to worry about severe winters like in Chicago that we have.
No, definitely not. It never gets that cold, that's for sure.
Yeah. I want to visit one day. I'm going to come there and then we'll hook up and have a coffee. How's that? But they don't drink coffee in Mexico.
Oh, yes, they do. Sure. Sure they do. I was out of my favorite coffee place this morning, a place called Panino's, an Italian-style bakery down here, and they serve really great Americanos, if you like Americano, which is one of my favorite types of coffee.
Oh, good. Because normally when you think of Mexico, people are on a beach with a nice cold, tall drink, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's that too. One of the major reasons I like that place is because they have air conditioning, and where I'm living, it does not. So actually, let me rephrase that. There is an air conditioner here, but it doesn't work. So going to a place like Panino's gives me a nice break from the heat of the day. It's summer down here, so it's fairly hot, or it can be hot and humid. And so going to a place like that gives me a nice break from the humidity.
So I want to ask you to tell me a little bit about yourself, but I'm going to ask you a question before that. How is it, you sound American, right? And you moved to Mexico. Tell me about that.
Well, number one, and it's funny how often that comes up. I'm not an American.
Oh.
And I'm not from the States.
Okay.
Yeah. And your reaction is kind of typical of those who I've encountered, but many people assume that I'm from the States. I'm not really sure why, but they do. Actually, I'm from Canada. And the last city I was living in was Victoria, British Columbia. Okay. I left there 4 years ago, well, almost 4 years ago, to come here.
So did you move because of the climate?
That was part of it, yeah. Well, there were a lot of things, but it was just, it's been a long time coming because I didn't want to live in Canada anymore. Part of the reason was weather and the cost of living. But I just got tired of being cold. And down here, that's something I really don't have to worry about. If anything, I get too hot, which is the reverse issue. And no, I just, it was time. And the reason I am where I am is because a colleague of mine asked me a question about a year ago at this time, because I was stuck. I was living in a place called Ensenada. I wasn't happy with being there, and I didn't really know where I wanted to go. And my colleague asked me a question, which was, if there's only one place in the world that you could choose to be year-round, where would it be? And after a couple of minutes, I wrote down Bucerias. And I remember thinking, oh boy, it's going to be hot in the summer, which it is. But overall, it's my favorite place down in Mexico. So I posted a couple of ads for house sitting, got a response in 1 hour, landed an opportunity here. And when I got here, I had 2 more opportunities. I took one. I went back to Ensenada for a bit, and then I did the house sitting thing again. This time I got another opportunity for 6 months. I'm just coming to the tail end of that now.
That's awesome. That's a good idea to travel that way.
Oh
Okay.
yeah, I mean it's amazing how easy it is to get a gig for house sitting. Most people don't know how to do that.
No, I mean this is awesome. You have the brains for it. I didn't. I even know this was an option.
Um, well, I found out about it through a friend of mine years ago. She was house sitting, and I remember thinking I'd like to get into it, but couldn't figure out how. And then some years later, I was offered an opportunity. I took it, and then this thing came up, and I just wrote an ad based on what I know about copywriting, and it got me a response almost immediately. So
Great. That's
anyway,
that's awesome. So then I'm going to ask you, tell me a little bit about yourself.
well, for the last number of years, I've been involved in getting help for mental issues, mental problems that started when I was 19. It eventually led to getting onto the spiritual journey, which I've been on since, formally, since about 1994. And one of the major things that happened about 10 years ago is a thing called spiritual awakening. And one of the things about spiritual awakening that a lot of people don't know is that they think that when you have an awakening, that's the end of the story. You hang up your enlightenment shingle and life goes on. But that's not the way it works for most people. Very few people, from what I understand, have an awakening that's complete. In other words, none of the past conditioning comes back. But for the vast majority of people, it's not the end of the story. You have the awakening, you go through the joy and all of that, but then eventually it recedes and what is left over comes back. Like one of my teachers put it this way, his name is Adyashanti. He was saying that when awakening happens, there is a part of your life where you have all these bad things, one could call them skeletons in the closet. And he said that when awakening happens, the veil that covers that is destroyed and all of the stuff from your past will come up and you'll be forced to deal with it. And so one of the things that came up, especially as of late, is a major problem with something I've had called self-sabotage and dissociative amnesia. And it's something that happened for the first time when I was 10 years old. I was humiliated in front of my class in grade 5 because I gave a report on the topic of amoebas, and my classmates called me stupid and a liar. And the shock of it created the self-sabotage, the belief that I'm stupid, and dissociative amnesia, so I couldn't remember what had happened. And after that, I failed my way through school until one day when I was 23 and I was standing in the locker room at a tech school and thinking about that I was doing fairly well, and the thought, where did I ever get the idea that I was stupid came to mind. And that's when the amnesia faded. I remembered everything about what happened. And when that happened, I remembered all the humiliation, all the pain, and it went away and my marks took off after that. But the problem with self-sabotage and the amnesia that went with it repeated many times throughout my life in a whole bunch of different situations. And so when it came up again a number of months ago, I mean, I knew that I was angry. I knew that I was dealing with a problem to do with self-sabotage, but I wouldn't let go, even though I knew what the high cost it was creating in my life. But what happened is I wound up with a dental emergency, and that's what's shocked me out of the denial, out of the pattern. And that's when I really started to look at it. And actually this morning, one of the things that I was doing is I found a video by Tony Robbins who talks about it and talks about how to finally overcome it. And it's different from what I was doing to overcome it. And I find that what he is offering is considerably better than what I had in mind. But the other side of this whole thing is, if you have someone who suffers from dissociative amnesia, which has been a major problem for me, and after a while though, like the first time it happened when I was 10, I couldn't remember anything. I didn't even know I had amnesia. I didn't know I had a problem at all. And so there was no way I could get back into it. But over the years, a bit of an awareness dawned where I could actually notice that I was having these events that would trigger amnesia. And a number of years ago, I discovered a technique for releasing it. And when I discovered this technique was by a guy by the name of, his name is Robert Smith. And he created another version of the emotional freedom technique, which he calls faster emotional freedom technique. And so with that, I was able to take the exercise that he had on amnesia, apply it to my own life, because I knew I was suffering from a problem to do with that. And as a result of what I did, following his instructions, I was able to find my way back into the memories and release them.
Wow. So you've gone through a lot of stuff, and then it's
Yep.
come to realization. But you talk, the biggest thing that I heard you talk about was self-sabotage, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're not the only one that does it. I do it myself, and everybody
Yeah.
else who's going to listen to it is going to say, hey, I do the same thing.
Yeah, with the self-sabotage, it depends on the severity of it as to how much of an impact it has in your life. My particular situation was extremely severe, the result of a lot of abuse. And instead of dealing with it in a way that would have been empowering, that would have lifted me out of it, I wound up going with old conditioning. And the way that it had a tendency to manifest is it would be automatic and unconscious. And when the amnesia kicked in, then I couldn't remember what I had done. But in this particular case, I just had a tremendous amount of anger because of what happened, and a lot of fear because of the abuse, and I just wouldn't look at it. And eventually, when I had that dental emergency a few months ago, that's what finally broke me out of the pattern, and I finally started looking at it. So, I mean, in terms of self-sabotage, there are many different ways of dealing with it, but the first step is awareness of some sort, and looking for a way to end it. But in my particular case, I was holding on to it, even at the high price I was paying for doing it. Just a combination of anger and fear. But when this one event happened, it finally knocked me out of that. And then I was able to start looking at it. So, I mean, the first step with dealing with this is realizing that you're doing it to yourself. And a lot of people don't. Like if you look at many homeless people, and granted there's a certain amount of mental illness out there, but I was actually homeless for a while myself, and I got to see what was going on the street. And one of the things that I noticed, and maybe it was a projection, is that there were a number of people out there because they were dealing with some sort of intolerable pain in their lives, which they couldn't handle in any way at all. So their way of dealing with it was alcohol or drugs or mental illness even. One never knows what drives people to that point, but I could see it very clearly when I was on the street, and I could certainly see what I was dealing with. It wasn't enough to break me out of the pattern, though. And life kept coming back and trying to break me out of it, and I kept saying, no, I want to hold on to my anger and my whatever, but it finally got to a point where enough is enough. And so when you're looking at some of these people on the street, drugs, alcohol, and so on, if they have numbed themselves enough to not be able to face what's causing the pain, it will be very difficult to get through to them. And there are many people out there who do things like interventions, but they don't always work. The case in point is Whitney Houston. Her family did an intervention, she walked out. So it's a bit of a crapshoot. And as to how it will come about, how to overcome it is not the easiest thing, but awareness is the first step. That's what has to happen first. If there's no awareness, good luck in breaking through.
Wow. No, I mean, you just made me aware of it, that you don't always judge the book by its cover, right? And there's so many people out there who need help. So how did you overcome self-sabotage?
Well, the first step was becoming aware of it. And the second step was really starting looking else. Now,
Excuse me.
Salute. Yeah. So, I mean, in my case, it had to do with major abuse from the Canada Revenue Agency over income tax. And the thing that sent me into the self-sabotage and fear was receiving a demand one day for a bunch of tax money that I couldn't pay. And I was really, really angry with them because there was a lot of abuse that went on with that agency in my life for a number of years. And when I got that letter, it just triggered me into the self-sabotage and amnesia because I was just furious with the way it was being treated. Instead of working with it in a positive way, I went with my conditioning, which created that problem. So, and I apologize if I didn't answer your question correctly. I was just wondering if you could ask it again.
No, so how are you overcoming this self-sabotage?
Well, the number one step was awareness. The second step was looking at the areas of my life where I was really afraid. And the major part had to do with income tax in Canada and the abuse by that agency. And since I was here in Mexico, one of the things that I had a number of years ago is I made a connection with a guy who's a former auditor for the Canada Revenue Agency. And he wrote a book called The Tax Collector's Bible, which is how I got to know him. He had an affiliate program. I was part of that. When the affiliate program collapsed, he offered me tax counseling in return. So I reached out to him and I told him what my problems were. And he said to me, okay, this is what you need to do. And he told me that I needed to call the agency to talk with them to find out what my status was. I did that. I went through all the steps of everything that he told me to do. And then after that, filed a number of returns for the last few years, and the last two indicating that I'm here in Mexico and that I'm declaring myself a non-resident of Canada. So I finally faced my biggest fears to do with what was going on. And as a result, started to move past that. And then this morning, doing a search on overcoming self-sabotage and finding a video by Tony Robbins, which has been really, really good. And again, he talks about it, but he talks about it, how to overcome it using neurolinguistic programming and using specific techniques for dealing with it. One of the things he says, is you have to identify the problem, of course, what it is. And one of the steps is writing down in detail what it's cost you. What does the sabotaging pattern cost you? And then writing out another thing where you're rewiring your brain to go in a positive direction with it. What you'll get if you change the pattern. And he also talks about a technique, I think it's called the erasure technique, which has to do with when the pattern comes up, to use this technique to scramble it. And if you do it enough times, it will mess up the pattern in your mind so much that it more or less destroys the pattern of the self-sabotage. Because that's the issue, is that somewhere along the line, you wound up with a pattern. And he was saying it could just be a habit, or if it's happened repeatedly, one could call it a pattern. And one of the things he was saying is not to identify too much with the idea of self-sabotage, because it may not actually be that. If something's happening in your life, that it may not actually be this thing called self-sabotage. He said, don't identify with the labels too much. Just look at what's going on in your life, because what may be happening could just simply be the result of poor attention and not watching what you're doing, not being aware of what you're doing, which creates a problem. And he said, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's this thing called self-sabotage. It might be something else, just poor attention, poor habits, things that you can change fairly easily. And he was saying not to identify with the label too much. In my case, though, it was definitely a pattern, and largely unconscious and automatic. It wasn't something I had any control over. But this last time around was one of the most severe examples of it. But there's other times I've been able to catch it and undo the damage of it without doing anything special. Like I had a thing which happened a number of years ago to do with a relationship, and it caused a problem. And I didn't even realize that I was suffering from it until one day I realized I couldn't feel anything, and I didn't know why. And then as a result of meeting this one woman and talking with her, I suddenly realized that it had happened again. But this time I was able to see it, figure it out, and release it without any major intervention techniques. I just was able to look at the amnesia, look at the self-sabotage, and then just start pulling myself out of it just by the awareness of it alone and being able to look at it. Other times like this one problem with the taxing has been far more difficult because it tapped into a whole bunch of negative beliefs I had to begin with. And we all have those to one degree or another. And so it's just the way my mind works. I mean, like I said, when I first showed up when I was 10, it's not like I had any choice. It's not like I knew what was happening. I was 10 years old. I was a kid. What did I know? But it wasn't until years later that when it had repeated enough times that I started to see that I had a major problem, a pattern going on. How do I stop it? The first step was the realization, oh, I've got this problem. How can I prevent it? And part of it, if you're asking like how to prevent it, part of it was not so much awareness. It had to do with what happens when a traumatic event happens. Because quite often I would go into automatic or I would have knee-jerk reactions. So for example, if I received a nasty phone call or a vicious email, which could trigger something like that, I started to do something counterintuitive, contrary to what would happen before. So if I'd get a vicious email, my typical way of dealing with it was a knee-jerk response. But quite often that was the worst thing I could have done because I'd come from a place of reactivity and anger. And quite often that would make things worse. And so what I trained myself to do is that whenever something like that would happen, especially if I'm on the computer, which is how it would usually show up, is to force myself to get up and walk away and to not respond at all. And so, and to let the shock or the, whatever it is, the intensity of the attack or assault or to feel it, but not do anything about it. And just feel it, let it go through my body like a lightning rod, if you will. But it would just be to let the feelings happen without letting my mind go into a drama, without my mind starting to create amnesia or anything else. So it would just become really hyper aware of what was going on. And I would just let myself feel it and try not to think about it too much, because thinking about it inevitably made it worse. So just let the shock, the feeling dissipate, and I stay away from my computer for at least an hour, maybe 2. And then I would come back and look at or listen to or see whatever it is and see if I could actually sit there without having a reaction. If I had a reaction again, I'd get up and leave again. Sometimes I'd leave it for a day or 2 before I'd respond. But the idea is to come back to it once the energy of the shock is gone, and then be able to sit there and look at what's in front of me without having a reaction. Or if there is a reaction, very minimal. And then once I was able to sit there and deal with it in that way, then I could come from a place of response rather than reactivity. So I could respond in a much better way. So I might choose to write something, or if it's someone being abusive on my timeline, whether to block that person. There would just be a different way of doing it. So I've had to train myself to do this. And the more I train myself to do it, the less I have trouble with things like self-sabotage or any of the amnesia that would go on. So a lot of this is just simply retraining yourself. And ironically, that's what Tony Robbins was talking about in that video today. Recognizing it, identifying it, writing about the cost of it, writing about what you want to have instead, using an exercise to scramble the pattern in your mind so that it doesn't work anymore. But ultimately, you have to rewire yourself. And doing my own version of that. And as for the dissociative amnesia, what I learned to do with that with Robert Smith is what he said, and it really struck me because I wasn't looking for anything that day, but I stumbled onto this. And what he said is amnesia leaves clues in terms of feelings of the body. And he said, so if you know that you're suffering from an amnesic episode, he said, follow the feelings. And the next day, after reading that, after watching that video, I was out at a farmer's market and I was noticing the feelings. And as I was noticing the feelings, a question came to mind that I'd never thought of before. And as I pondered the question, it was like I could look around a dark wall in my mind, and I recovered all the memories within an instant. Everything rushed back. It just flooded my mind. I was completely aware of it. And then once that happened, it dissolved, and then I was able to move on with my life.
You make a good point. So there's a lot of people who have this, and they may not have a name for it, but you just named it. And you know what you helped, what the listeners that are listening right now, you just help them dissipate this anger and everything. You remind me, you have a calm demeanor around you, which is awesome. I had a boss like that, and he would always tell me, you know, and when I was first doing my management stuff, there was a nurse that would get on our nerves, and this was pharmacy and nursing, and you know, there was always a departmental clash there. And she sent me emails, and then, you know, one thing led to another, and my boss said, don't send that. And I was like, sent, you know.
Yeah.
He's like, you know, you're going to have to bear the consequences. Now you just made your cross, now you have to bear it. And
Yeah.
but I noticed that was one valuable lesson that he taught me was anytime you get an email or when you're writing an email, don't react, you know, write it on a Word document, not on the email. Just put it on a Word document. If you lose it, it's meant to be. If it's not losing it, then you can come back and reword it. And that lesson has really been very, very valuable to me because I have learned how to not react, you know, just take a step back, walk away, come back, you know, and that's that the people need to learn. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much for sharing that.
You're welcome. Yeah, it took a long time to figure it out. It's just that I'd known for a long time that what I was doing was not working. And there was one time when I was on a question and answer site called Quora, and I was attacked by a bully and did the knee-jerk response thing and wrote this thing. And then after 20 minutes of letting it go out into the cyberspace, I thought, I've just been suckered by an old pattern. And I went back into Quora and I deleted every single thing that I'd written. And instead of writing a response, I blocked the person in question and reported the person to the moderators for abuse. And that was actually the right approach. But I wound up going through this other thing first. And now when I see people being abusive online to something that I'm saying, sometimes I just look at it going, you know, what's going on here? And because people online, sometimes they do stuff where they think they're being funny, or they think they're being useful, but they're not. They're taking pot shots and so on. And sometimes I just leave it. And other times I go, look, guys, this is my thread. I'm the one in charge of this. And if you want to comment on it, you've got to be civil. And if you're not going to be civil, you have no place in my thread. And so I've blocked a number of people. Now, the worst episode that happened a while ago was talking about what I'm talking about right now. And I did a Facebook Live. And it was kind of interesting because I wound up with two very polarized responses at the end. And one of them came from a woman I've known for a number of years, but she was being really negative, and I countered her on it. And then she kept just harping on it. Finally, I confronted her privately. And then she sent me one of the most vicious messages I've seen in years. As the expression goes, trying to rip me a new one. And I just looked at it and I thought, I did have a reaction, But I did step away from it too. And I finally just went back to it and I thought, enough. And I didn't even bother to respond. I just deleted the message. I blocked her and thought, well, there were a lot of things I could have said. But the thing that I know about some of these interactions is that any response just fuels the drama. And so sometimes the simplest, best thing to do is no response at all, and use the blocking and reporting functions, depending on what the software app you're using is. It's just not worth it to engage with someone who's a hater or a troll or a bully online. It's just easier just to block them and get them out of your life.
That's a very sane advice, you know. Thank you for leaving that with us, because I know that people get ruffled all the time, and then there's words exchanged, and then I sometimes watch the attorney shows on TV, and you have, oh, he sent me this and he sent me that, and you know, you look at the root of the problem, it's like we don't even know what the root of the problem was, but you know, all the bad words we remember. So that's sure. Nice, you know. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being on my show. And what you've shared with us is very, very profound, right? One of them is self-sabotaging yourself, one. Two, you know, don't be angry. Don't react. You know, that's another thing. It's like, don't react. Come back and look at it rationally, and then either block the person or just don't answer. Because when you answer, it's like throwing the fuel to the fire, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah, for sure.
My father used to say that. He says, just walk away and don't say anything. So I've learned that. It's come from wise people in my life.
Oh, good. You're fortunate then.
Yeah, but the thing is, as a young person and a hot-headed person, you are able to conquer the world. But the wisdom comes as you grow older and, you know, sane-headed and not hot-headed, right?
Easier said than done. It takes practice. I mean, the real key, as I've said repeatedly, is awareness. Realizing that there is an issue. Realizing that you've got a problem and think, okay, well, what can I do about it? Because I don't want this to keep happening. And that was part of what was going on my end. It's because I was realizing how much I was hurting myself by the knee-jerk response. So I literally had to train myself to do something different.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Again, I'm honored and humbled that you're on my show.
Thank you for having me.
And for those people who are watching, please go ahead, like, subscribe, and share this video, because it's got a lot of different nuggets. It doesn't just come from self-sabotaging. You've got lots of advice that Nathan Segal has shared with us. One of them is don't stop the self-sabotaging. Yes, you have those questions. Yes, you have the little angel and the little devil, and they'll talk to you. But do what you think is right. Listen to your heart, listen to your brain, and stop the self-sabotage. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Munira's Musings with your host, Munira Zahabi. If you enjoyed our show, please share and subscribe to this channel. And for more content, please join our Facebook group called Navigate to Your Niche.